Hello and welcome to BookLab, the podcast where we check out what's new in the world of popular science books. I'm your host, science journalist Dan Falk.
And I'm your other host, science journalist Amanda Gefter.
In this episode, how many universes are there anyway? Physicist Max Tegmark says there could be an infinite number of universes, and he argues the case in his latest book, Our Mathematical Universe.
And later we have the On the Nightstand portion of the show, where Dan and I will dip into our personal libraries and talk about a couple of recent science books that you might have missed.
But first, Our Mathematical Universe. Max Tegmark is a physicist at MIT, and this is his first book, Our Mathematical Universe. And in it he argues that, contrary to what you might naively suppose, that the universe is everything there is, so there's only one of them, but he presents an argument for why there are, in fact, multiple universes. And this actually raises a number of philosophical issues, and we will get to that. Believe me, we will get to that in a moment. But first, we should probably talk about the arguments, how he has built this argument, because it is based on current ideas in physics. And in fact, Max Tegmark has sort of come up with a classification scheme, so he's got 4 kinds of multiverses altogether?
That's right. So these 4 levels of multiverse are nested one into the next like Russian dolls. And the first level is just if our universe is infinite in space. So we live in a universe that's been expanding for 13.8 billion years.
The time since the Big Bang.
Exactly. And so we can only see a small part of that. But if the universe is actually infinite, then you just get more galaxies, more planets, and eventually more Earths and more of each one of us. And so if it's really infinite, there's an infinite number of us having, infinite versions of this conversation.
Now that's pretty mind-blowing, but is that considered sort of a standard argument in physics?
It is. I mean, it's sort of a natural consequence of infinity. So if you really have an infinite space, you're just sort of bound to have these infinite copies.
The mathematics dictates that you're confronted with this.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's the level 1. Level 2 comes about when this inflationary process that expands the universe stops in our universe but keeps going in other regions. And this is sort of naturally what happens in these theories. And so our universe, even this whole infinite universe with these infinite copies of us, that's just one bubble within this larger multiverse where you have an infinite number of bubble universes.
So I remember reading about this in Scientific American. I think this is sometimes called eternal inflation.
That's right. That's right. And so you have this huge multiverse, and the laws of physics can look very different in each one, and so that becomes very interesting. More so than just the level 1 where the laws of physics are the same everywhere. It's just that it's infinite and you get these infinite copies. The level 3 multiverse is conceptually a little bit different because it doesn't come about from space just being bigger, but reality itself sort of being bigger. And so this comes about from quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, you have these sort of Schrödinger cat situations where things can be in multiple states at the same time.
So this is the famous poor cat that is both alive and dead, because in one universe, let's say, he's the vial with the poison was broken because a radioactive particle decayed, so the cat dies, but then you have to imagine that there's another universe where the particle didn't decay, so the poison gas was not dissipated, and therefore the cat lives.
That's right. Well, the original founders of quantum mechanics didn't have this idea of the parallel universes. So they thought the cat's just sort of alive and dead until somebody opens the box, and then the sort of quantum state collapses into one or the other. And so suddenly the cat is either alive or dead. But the theory never explained how that collapse happens. Mm-hmm. And so Hugh Everett in the 1950s came up with this interpretation of quantum mechanics in which the collapse doesn't happen. And so instead you get this branching of reality in which, as you said, in one universe the cat is alive, in another universe the cat is dead. And so every time we encounter any kind of decision, we flip a coin, we see it come up heads or tails, but presumably in this interpretation there would be another universe in which the opposite outcome.
It's almost like the or gets replaced with an and.
Exactly.
So instead of where I would say, the coin, I'm going to toss a coin and it's going to come up head or tails. But in this way of looking at things, it's both. It's heads and tails, but in different universes.
That's right. And the outcomes seem random to us, but Tegmark explains that they only seem random because we don't know which universe in this multiverse we're in. So the level 4...
No, well, the level 4 one is a bit... Not that the first 3 are like simple, but level 4 is kind of funny, right? It's a little bit different from the first 3.
Yeah, it's even more radical.
So let's save that for a moment, and let's look at let's talk about the book itself for a moment. What was your sort of gut reaction on going through this book?
Well, first I want to say that I think this book has the best first sentence I've ever seen. I have to give him props for that. It's
Tell us the first sentence.
the first sentence is, "A second later, I died." And I was just hooked on that sentence.
It's provocative, right?
It's very provocative.
So, does he die?
In one universe, he does.
Okay. He lives long enough to write the book.
Exactly. Luckily, in our universe.
And there's some very solid physics in, I guess, the first half of the book. I mean, he's taking us sort of on a pretty good tour of today's conception of the universe, right?
That's right, and he's sort of very clear about distinguishing between what's very established physics and what's more speculative.
Yeah, which is important, right?
Which is really important, and he writes it in such a charming, fun way, and at the same time is very deep. Like, he's not really dumbing down these ideas. So it's deep stuff, but told in a very entertaining way, and you sort of get this look of what it's like to really be a scientist. You know, he's staying up late working on things, or he makes a discovery and he's so excited that he's discovered something that's going to be known as the Tegmark effect, and then only to find out that it's something that was discovered 2 decades earlier and is already well known.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I thought I had discovered the Falk effect, and
exactly.
Turns out, no.
Silly Einstein always came up with it first.
Yeah.
So you just get this view of what it's like to be a physicist, and at the same time it's very relatable because he's just sort of this fun character.
Yeah, it is quite a fun read and quite an enjoyable read. But there is something about the argument that, sort of raises eyebrows, and if you're a philosopher or you're just sort of a concerned citizen reading his argument, you might be concerned about a few things. So one problem is, people will say, this idea of multiple universes isn't testable. What experiment can you do? What observation can you make that's going to put this to the test, either confirm or refute the theory? And if there isn't one that you can think of, then basically the theory is not falsifiable, and then people are going to say it's not science. So it's, a fascinating idea, but does it really count as science?
That's right, and Tegmark has a great comeback for this because he emphasizes that parallel universes are not a theory, they're predictions of certain theories. And so if you trust theories like eternal inflation or quantum mechanics, you sort of are stuck with these parallel universes. So eternal inflation, for instance, makes falsifiable predictions. And so you can test those predictions, and if those tests come out in favor of inflation, and inflation tells you you get parallel universes, then, he's basically saying you can't test every single implication of a theory. So you test the ones that you can, and then you have to trust the theory at some point.
And he makes an interesting analogy, and I think it's a fairly good one. He compares it to Einstein's theory of gravity, general relativity, which, when Einstein put it forward, it was actually hard to test all of its predictions. They tested the orbit of Mercury, and a bit later they tested the gravitational redshift, and what was the third one? There was the bending of starlight during a solar eclipse in 1919. But this theory made other more exotic predictions, like the existence of black holes. And to this day, I mean, of course, there's very, very solid indirect evidence for the existence of black holes, but we can't touch one. We can't send a spaceship to investigate a black hole. But we sort of imagine that black holes actually do exist because the theory has performed so well in the realms where we have tested it.
Black holes are actually a great analogy because a black hole, by definition, can't be seen, right? It's black. I mean, that's the whole point of what a black hole is. And likewise, the very definition of a parallel universe is a universe that we can't access. And so it's sort of unfair to demand experimental observation of things that are just, by definition, unobservable.
Well, that's true, but you can see why this gets people cranky, right? Because it's like, I'm postulating a thing that you can't investigate, but you have to trust me because, there's a pretty solid theory that predicts it. And if you can't do an experiment on it, that's just too bad.
It is a bit of an unfair advantage. Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing is, he does say that some aspects of the theory are directly testable, sort of. So one of them is that if these bubble universes have at some point collided with one another, they may have left an imprint in the CMB. And just for people who may not remember what we're talking about here, this is the cosmic microwave background. This is the sort of microwave echo of the Big Bang, this radiation that you can see using radio telescopes. But they haven't found that yet. I mean, nobody has actually found the imprint of these bubble universes.
And if they did, it's still an imprint that's in our universe, and so it's still like an indirect signature.
It would certainly, that's right, it would be indirect, and I bet, I mean, this hasn't happened yet, but I bet someone will say, okay, it could be the imprint of parallel universes, or, and I bet they would come up with some kind of alternative explanation that was limited to our own universe.
Yeah.
So there's that. Now we should talk just a little bit about this anthropic principle. It has to do with the so-called fine-tuning of the universe, that if the parameters, the values of the physical constants that sort of dictate how the universe evolved over time, if you tweak some of these parameters, you end up with a very different kind of universe, and typically you get a universe that wouldn't support life. And yet here we are, so we're trying to come up with some explanation for the fine-tuning.
Right. And if you have an infinite number of universes out there in which these numbers are different in every universe, then inevitably there will be a universe like ours, and we shouldn't be surprised that that's the one we find ourselves in.
And you know what? It's not surprising that there is sort of a theological, the people who sort of have a different way of interpreting things are going to say, you're trying to weasel your way out of acknowledging that the universe was specially constructed some way. I mean, I don't lean that way, and I know you don't lean that way. But there are people who will say that this multiverse thing is like a last gasp or a last...
It's true, but I think the comeback to that is that when you look at these theories like eternal inflation, this multiverse is sort of the most natural thing that can happen. So if you want to take inflation and only get one universe out of it, then you have to actually really fine-tune inflation. And so it's actually, in a way, you would have to weasel your way out of the multiverse.
Mm-hmm. So in fact, it's not so much that we're coming up with but it's not so much that the physics community is like, okay, what's the strangest theory we can come up with today? But they were forced into this position because there seems to be evidence out there for first the Big Bang, then inflation, and then maybe eternal inflation, and this is where you end up.
And they all point to the same thing, and then you throw string theory into the mix, and now you're really in that mode of thinking. And so it's true. I think that's something that the public doesn't always see. It just sounds like people are making up these really crazy ideas, and they don't realize that the mathematics is sort of forcing you into this situation.
Now, you've mentioned this issue of what's natural. When is a certain theory more natural than some other theory, and where is the mathematics led you? But people are going to say, all right, you've got an infinite number of universes. That sounds like something that's carrying a lot of metaphysical baggage. It sounds very extravagant. People are going to say, this flies in the face of Occam's razor.
And Occam's razor says the simplest idea is usually the correct one.
And that often seems to have been the case, over the last 400 years of modern science. I mean, sometimes the complicated theory is correct, but usually, our theory of gravity, our theory of the motion of the planets, how the tides work, I mean, generally they've turned out to be sort of elegant at the fundamental level.
And physicists try to unify things so that where you had two ideas, you can sort of join them into one, because that's simpler. And here you're taking one universe, now you're multiplying it into an infinite number.
Well, that I can totally see people making that argument, and it was probably even, my reaction the first time I heard about this crazy idea. No, but this seemingly exotic idea. But Tegmark, of course, is well aware of this objection. And his response is that, Occam's razor calls for simplicity, but simplicity of what? And for Tegmark, it's not so much the arrangement of matter and energy that has to be simple, but the underlying theory. And I'll just quote from one sentence from the book. As a theoretical physicist, he writes, I judge the elegance and simplicity of a theory not by its ontology, but by the elegance and simplicity of its mathematical equations. And it's quite striking to me that the mathematically simplest theories tend to give us multiverses.
And we have other examples of that. Like if you look at fractal geometry, you get these incredibly complex patterns that if you just looked at it geometrically, you would say, this is incredibly complicated. But it turns out that the equation that generates that pattern is very short and simple.
Right, so Occam's razor has been incredibly useful over the history of modern science, but we have to be a little bit careful about what it is we're cutting with his razor and how we cut it.
Exactly.
Okay, now we didn't mention the level 4 multiverse. This is the last of his classification system. We've talked about 1, 2, and 3. So level 4 multiverse, it's that every mathematical structure what represents a universe is a universe?
Yeah, so Tegmark has this argument that when you look sort of deeply enough at physical reality, it turns out that all you can find there is mathematics. And so this table that's in front of us, we think it's made of some sort of physical stuff, but we don't, when we really sort of interrogate that notion of stuff, it sort of dissolves, and all you're left with are these mathematical relations. And so he makes this argument that actually it's not just that mathematics describes the physical world, it's that mathematics is the physical world.
Can we say that's a controversial claim?
It certainly is. I mean, there's a philosophical position called structural realism, which he's basically arguing for here. And he has very good physical reasons to make this argument. It's actually harder to argue the other way around, but it is sort of intuitively difficult.
I mean, it seems to me as a bit extravagant. I know some of the professional physicists reviewing his book in the press were also, sort of took him to task on this business. I mean, that he doesn't back it up quite as strongly as one might hope.
Well, so he's saying everything comes down to mathematics, and then you're sort of left with the question of, well, why would particular mathematics exist as this physical universe and others not, right? Because there's all kinds of mathematical structures, not just
right. So only certain ones are manifest in the world that we see.
Yeah, Hawking had that sort of famous line of like, what breathes fire into the equations, right? So what's breathing fire into some mathematical structure and not another? And Tegmark, again, applying Occam's razor and trying to sort of aim for the simplest explanation, says there's mathematical democracy and every mathematical structure equally exists. And so now you have this even bigger multiverse of all these different mathematical structures. So with the other level 1, 2, and 3 multiverses, they're all ultimately described by the same physics, the same math. But here, now you have a multiverse where there's, there might be a universe where quantum physics isn't even quantum physics. It's just getting more and more diverse as you go up.
Because the mathematics keeps changing.
Exactly.
I mean, it's a very bold, audacious claim, but you know what? And he may well be right. He may very well be right, but I can see why some people are going to say that's not an explanation. You have found an extraordinarily clever way of weaseling out of giving an explanation, right? Some people are going to say that.
I think that's definitely true. I think he's just sort of picking the simplest interpretation of this idea. So I think there's good argument for this idea that everything is made of math, but then to say, therefore, all math actually exists, there's just a leap there that is hard to back up.
Hard to back up. That's how it seems. Now, you had some concerns with some of the physics that he puts forward. Can you just explain that briefly?
So Tegmark discusses what he sees as the main criticisms that are going to be leveled against him. And the first one, he calls it omnivision assumption. And this is the assumption, which he believes is mistaken, that physical reality must be such that at least one observer can in principle observe all of it. So you could say, there's no observer that can see more than one universe, therefore you can't have more than one universe. And he dismisses this very quickly. He says this is just human hubris, and he sort of moves on. But there are a lot of physicists who would say, no, there's actual really good physical arguments for this idea that you have to sort of define things in terms of a given observer. And it sounds like it's just hubris, but actually this is the outcome of a lot of physics over the last 20 years. So the work that Stephen Hawking did on black hole radiation has sort of led to all of these different developments where people are realizing that you actually end up violating laws of physics when you try to describe the universe from this kind of God's eye view where you're seeing across multiple perspectives at the same time. And part of the issue is that when if you, let's say, pretend to see inside and outside a black hole simultaneously, what happens is you end up over-counting information. And so if you have an elephant that's outside the black hole, you're going to count it as also being inside. So now you have two elephants, but really there's only one elephant. And the reason is you have to stick to one reference frame. And so in this book where Tegmark's talking about these infinite copies of us, there's a real chance that there's an overcounting of information that's arising from this mistaken idea that you can talk across reference frames.
Okay, but surely Max Tegmark is aware of this problem?
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
so I think it's a shame that he just sort of dismissed it as hubris and kind of moved on, because I think that might be sort of the most interesting criticism of his work.
So you're saying basically that he has glossed over some fairly important physics here that actually warranted a bit more analysis.
He might be right that you can talk about this sort of God's eye view and this multiverse, and maybe you don't need to restrict to a single observer, but he would have to make a case for that. And I think there's a really deep discussion that could be had, a really sort of fascinating issue that touches on so much of what's going on in physics today, and it's just a shame that it's not in the book.
So maybe the book should have had another chapter.
Or maybe a sequel.
Okay. But Tegmark, he's a very creative thinker, and he was bold enough to pursue these ideas. I mean, he talks about this in the book. I mean, earlier in his career, some people had said to him, Max, if you keep going after these crazy ideas, it's going to harm your career.
He tells this great story in which he's just published a paper on this sort of idea that everything is made of mathematics, and he, as you said, gets an email from sort of a higher up saying, you have to put an end to this, keep it in the pub, keep it out of your papers. And he forwards this email to his father, and his father writes him back and quotes Dante, and the quote translates to "follow your own path and let people talk." And I think that, that's what he's doing in this book, and it's a really important thing to do. He sort of says, physicists give a lot of lip service to this idea that we should,
think outside the box.
Think outside the box, and yet, actually it's really frowned upon in the community. And so, he mentions John Wheeler as sort of being his hero, and John Wheeler was one of these guys that was not afraid to do this and sort of knew that he was going to be criticized, but did it anyway. And I think Tegmark's sort of following in his footsteps, and I think that's really important.
So more power to Max Tegmark, and for other thinkers like Max Tegmark who are not afraid to pursue some of these ideas which may not have a lot of support from the larger physics community. And of course, it's too early to say if people are still going to be talking about them in 50 or 100 years, but he was not afraid to stick with it. And again, the first half of the book has some very solid physics in it. It's very well written, and the second half of the book is very provocative. So I recommend it. It is, parts of it are probably possibly going to blow your mind. It's a very interesting book.
I recommend it too. I think he discusses some really deep ideas and in a very engaging and accessible way.
Okay, the book is Our Mathematical Universe by Max Tegmark, and coming up next, the On the Nightstand portion of the show.
Okay, Dan, so what's on your nightstand these days?
Well, a book that I read quite recently was A Universe from Nothing by Lawrence Krauss. And Lawrence Krauss is a physicist, so it ties into a book, the Tegmark book that we've just been talking about. A Universe from Nothing, and the subtitle is Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing. And in fact, it's a fairly literal title and subtitle, because one of the things he's arguing for is that the universe, well, essentially that physics has answered the question of where did the universe come from. And it basically came from something like a quantum fluctuation 13.7 billion years ago, and that's why we exist. Now, the book also, so there's some very good physics in it. Similar to the Max Tegmark book, it does sort of cover a lot of ground in what physicists and cosmologists believe about the origin and evolution of the universe, and that is all very solid because Lawrence Krauss is a first-rate physicist. Now, he is also presenting another argument, which is that philosophy and religion have not really been, well, basically that they offer nothing as an alternative. I'll just read a sentence or two from towards the end of the book. He's describing how rich and wondrous the discoveries are that physicists and astronomers have made over the last few hundred years. He says, "The great discoveries of the 20th and 21st centuries have not only changed the world in which we operate, they have revolutionized our understanding of the world, or worlds that exist, or may exist, just under our noses, the reality that lies hidden until we are brave enough to search for it. This is why philosophy and theology are ultimately incapable of addressing by themselves the truly fundamental questions that perplex us about our existence. Until we open our eyes and let nature call the shots, we're bound to wallow in myopia.
So he's actually lumping together theology and philosophy?
Yeah, I don't think he's confused the two with each other, but yes, I agree that, he's going after a couple of targets here, and for some reason he is simultaneously sort of attacking religion and philosophy kind of at the same time. And as it happens, I think he's probably on the right track with his view on religion, but his view on philosophy may be a little bit problematic. I think a philosopher would probably disagree with Lawrence Krauss over what the role of philosophy is, because I don't think there's actually a competition going on between philosophers and physicists to see who can offer the best explanation for the universe or who can come up with the best theories. I mean, coming up with theories is what scientists do. But I think there's still actually a role for philosophers, say, for example, in interpreting theories. We saw this 100 years ago with quantum mechanics, and people are still trying to figure out how to interpret it. So I think it's a bit premature to dismiss philosophy altogether. Amanda, you also read this book, didn't you?
I did, and I think, I think in a way Krauss does a disservice to his own cause here. He wants to really argue that we don't need religion anymore. Science can answer these big questions that we never thought it could, like how did the universe come from nothing? But actually, sort of ironically, I think a philosopher reading this would realize that he's making an unfounded leap in logic here, because he's saying, the universe came from nothing through a quantum fluctuation, but that's not really a universe from nothing, that's a universe from quantum mechanics. So where did quantum mechanics come from?
Yeah, I think there are definitely things you can find to argue with in Krauss's book, and I think actually that's part of what makes it interesting. So, I found it compelling. I think it's a very interesting read. There will certainly be things that many readers are going to disagree with. Again, it's A Universe from Nothing by Lawrence Krauss. Amanda, what's on your nightstand?
So on my nightstand is something that's a little less physicsy, but it's a book called Me, Myself, and Why, Searching for the Science of Self. This is by Jennifer Ouellette, who actually usually writes about physics, but this is a departure for her, and this gets into genetics and biology and neuroscience and psychology, as she's sort of trying to understand what it means to be a self. And she opens the book with this story that just was so powerful to me. It totally gripped me from the beginning. She's talking about living in New York after college, and she gets an envelope in the mail from her adoptive mother. And it says, here's your birth information. And this is the first time she's going to see her information about her biological mother.
Wow.
And there's a warning from her adoptive mother saying, just so you know, you'll see that you had a different name.
Yeah, a different first name.
A different first name. And she writes, names possess tremendous psychological power, and in that sense, the manila envelope contained the fragments of a self that might have been. And so it's sort of opening this envelope and realizing that she could have had this whole other life, sort of compels her to start thinking about, what does it really mean to be her, right? It's not her name. Is it her genes? Is it how she was raised? Is it, all these different things? And so, these are obviously questions that people have been talking about in, nature versus nurture for a really long time. Yeah. But she has this personal story that sort of propels her through the book and propels the reader through the book as she gets her genome sequenced and she gets a brain scan. And she actually, in a very fun chapter, takes LSD to see, what happens when your sense of self dissolves. And it's just a really, really engaging, interesting book. It covers a lot of ground. And it's interesting because I've seen some criticism where people say, oh, she's covering so much ground that she doesn't go deeply into anything, and therefore it's like a little bit too, on the surface. But I sort of thought, that's kind of the point, because her point is sort of like, even if you go as deep as you can into any of these given fields, you're not going to find the answer to the sense of self. So the sense of self has to be some sort of amalgamation of all of these different things.
So I haven't read this particular book, but from what you're saying, first of all, it sounds like a pretty interesting book, and I think I'd like to read it. But also, Jennifer Ouellette is a science journalist like the two of us, as opposed to Lawrence Krauss or Max Tegmark, who are professional scientists. And I think it matters. I mean, from what you're saying, the approach that she took to this book is different from the approach a scientist would have taken. Not only that, probably a scientist wouldn't have written the book.
I can't imagine, because if you're, a geneticist or a neuroscientist, or, if you're in some particular field, you're probably just going to focus on that aspect. And it was her ability to sort of, take this God's eye view that we've been talking about and sort of put together this larger picture for the reader that I don't think a scientist could necessarily do.
So it sounds really interesting. And even though there have been a lot of books about the brain, especially in the last few years, and also a fair number of books about consciousness and different theories of how consciousness might come about, it sounds like she has found an original approach.
It's very original. She makes it original by including her personal story. And in a way, her personal story is sort of about parallel universes, the way we've been talking about. She's wondering what this parallel life could have been and what it means, to have a self in these different circumstances. And so I think, just like these cosmology books, her book raises some very fundamental and fascinating questions. The book is Me, Myself, and Why, Searching for the Science of Self, and the author is Jennifer Ouellette.
You've been listening to episode 1 of BookLab. Look for us on iTunes and on SoundCloud. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/BookLabPodcast. And follow us on Twitter at BookLab Podcast. And speaking of Twitter, my own Twitter handle is Dan Falk.
And mine is Amanda Gefter.
And you can also email us at booklabhosts@gmail.com.
Bye for now. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on BookLab.